Welcome back to Project X. Today we are going to get into a little bit of the rotating assembly on our block. This is a very detail-oriented process. I do have the assistant today, Eric, helping me out. It's great when you have a second person to do some of this type of work because it's very finite. We're going to be checking bearing clearances. We're going to talk about how to color or match the bearings. They are color-coded for Yamaha, which could be a challenge. And how do you decipher which one do you need? We're going to be installing new crank today, new crankshaft, connecting rods, pistons, rings. We're going to show you all of that in detail, and we're also going to show you how to check your clearances to make sure that your oil clearance is within specifications before you start this thing up. There's nothing worse than firing up and having no oil pressure. So we're going to show you how to do that as well. We got all new parts from SBT to put in our actual block assembly. And of course, the first thing I'm going to probably do is clean up the bore a little bit with a flex hone. Just make sure everything's clean in there, no scratches, no gouges. The bore looks great, all 4 cylinders, but I'm just going to spend a little bit of time cleaning those out. It only takes a few minutes, and it's worth the time and investment to get yourself a flex hone to be able to kind of just clean that bore up. So we're going to go through all those processes today, and it's great again to have a second person here giving me a hand with this, because you're going to see when you're installing the pistons, it's a lot easier with a second person who can kind of guide the connecting ring from hitting anything or gouging anything, or installing the rings together and kind of watching all that, and deciphering and reading the manual together. It really helps you kind of figure out exactly what you need to do. So yeah, we're going to get into that today, so keep an eye out for everything we're doing, and hopefully you'll be able to figure this out at home as well.
This season of Project X is brought to you by SBT, the largest supplier of high-quality jet ski parts in the world.
The flex hone is going to make sure that we're cleaning up the cylinders. It also gives us a little bit more of a crosshatch back into our cylinder bores, which is important for oil retention inside our engine. This just cleans it up a little bit, make sure that there's no scratches, no gouges or anything like that. Just a little cleanup process. We're not actually physically removing any metal. Important when you're using a flex hone, make sure you got oil on it, on top of this, and in the cylinder itself. You don't need a lot of strokes to kind of clean up the cylinder. We're only going about 6 to 8 times on each one, and that's going to be what I need. Then I'll clean the cylinders out, make sure there's no residue on there with a nice lint-free cloth, and then we're going to start getting into the actual pistons assembly with that. Now that that's all done, it's important to make sure that you clean the cylinders before you start installing pistons to make sure that there's no residue or anything like that behind. Use a nice lint-free cloth and clean everything out to make sure that it looks good. And a good inspection also at that point as well, not that you have everything clean, just to make sure that the cylinder bore looks good. You can really see the cross-hatching inside the cylinder bore now. The bore looks really good, the cylinders are in great shape, and that flex hone put us a real nice crosshatch back on our cylinders walls. Cylinder block is ready now for reassembly with our pistons. We're going to go through installing the new pistons, the new piston rings, and the connecting rods and the wrist pins as well, and start assembling that. And it'll be a lot easier when I can lay this on the side, and I'll have my assistant helping me do that. And we'll go through the process of installing rings so you can see that too. I do not need the connecting rods or the old pistons anymore, as SBT has provided us all the necessary parts that we need. So I'm just going to move these out of the way. I don't really need them anymore anyways. These were the bearings that were found in the actual lower ends where our crankshaft was. A couple things when you're inspecting bearings to see what the condition of them are. You want to make sure that without a glove, that running your fingernail, you're not catching any part of a deep gouge or anything like that. That would be cause for some alarm. That means that there have been some metal embedded in there that spun into this bearing and possibly caused a groove, which will affect your oil pressure and things like that. But just take a general inspection of them, make sure that they're in good condition. They tell you a lot about how everything's been working, how the oiling system's been working, how well everything's been moving, and these are in excellent shape. No deep gouges, nothing on those regards to have me being concerned about anything that else to be looking for. So this looks good. There has been a lot of questions out. If you were going to just have to remove the connecting rod from the piston, how would you go about doing that? Well, this one's a little bit of a different situation on these ones. You'll see on some automotive applications you would have to heat this up, but not in the case on this one. We do have a little groove here, and you have a snap ring that we can go ahead and work our way out with a nice little pick. Got it.
I heard that.
Now that that snap ring is out, you can push your piston pin out. And then now we're separated. There is a right and a wrong way to install your connecting rod. The connecting rods will be marked with the position that they need to go facing the front of the engine. Pay close attention when you're reading the service manual that you pay attention to that orientation, which we'll show you in greater detail when we're reassembling. Now, of course, reassembly, how do you put it back together, is just the reverse. So you've got your snap ring that'll go right back in your grooves. But that is, pay attention, you got different directions, different markings on the connecting rod, and we'll show you which way that needs to go in when we're starting to reinstall everything. This is also where your piston rings lie. Your piston rings, on this one we have 2 up top here, and then we have an oil one down here at the bottom as well. We're going to install new ones. We have new piston rings with new pistons. We're going to walk you through that. Removing a piston ring is very simple. Just kind of grab it with your fingernail and it'll come right off. And of course the opposite would be to gently install it this way. These are marked as well for a top or a bottom of the ring. We'll show you that in greater detail when we open up our SBT piston assemblies and start installing those as well. So we're going to take a look what's inside our SBT piston box and see what came with it. Got our piston, new wrist pin, and piston rings, all included. One thing you'll notice on this piston right here, you have this divot here. This is going to indicate which way the piston goes in this bore. It's going to be that way or that way. But that's what that's for. So you'll see that marked in the service manual as well, and that's what we'll show you which way that goes when we get that all together. You'll also notice STD is on here. This stands for standard. This is a standard size piston. If you ever opened up an engine and you saw maybe 20 marked there or 30, that would indicate that the bore itself may have been out of round or untrue. They made the piston bore a little bit bigger and they went with a oversized piston. We call it 30 over or 20 over or whatever that is. But this is a standard size piston. We didn't have to bore anything out. Standard size hole for this piston right now. And it's never a bad idea while you have everything apart to just make sure that everything seems to fit as it should before you start really assembling everything. I like to make sure that it fits in the bore as it should before I start making everything, putting everything together. So you notice in the packaging we have here, we have a couple different options for piston rings here. It came with 5 different rings in here, and they go in a specific order and a specific way. The top of these are marked, and I can see, and if you see any writing on these piston rings, that means they're going to face up on the piston here itself. And you'll notice there's also 2 different material and different types depending on what the application is. The one thing that's important about installing these piston rings is, one, try not to gouge the actual skirt or the top of the piston. And Eric, what's the other thing we got to really pay attention to?
I just want to pay attention to the orientation of the gap on the piston rings. The top ring and the second ring should be 180 degrees off. And then on the oil control rings, you want to stagger those gaps as well, 45 degrees off, and make sure that they don't, coincide with either the top or second ring.
And that's very important, because you'll see when I install this piston ring, I have a gap right now that you can see. When it's of course compressed inside the engine, it is almost gone. But you never want to just line up all of the gaps on the same one right there. You want them all staggered so that there is no gap in the same place. So the next ring I'm going to install will be 45, 90 degrees or 180 degrees from this gap itself. And I'm going to keep staggering the whole way so that no gap lines up with another gap as well. All right, oil control ring is your 3-piece design. That was in the bottom groove right down here. That's going to help so that we're not getting oil inside our combustion chamber to burn it, which we have found out that that was what was happening prior to it coming in here for us assembling it. We had a bad oil control ring on piston number 2, I believe, that was causing all that. But keep in mind with your oil ring, you have a very thin ring, you have another wavy style ring, and then a ring on top of that. So it's basically 3 pieces on there. Lettering up, and just be gentle when you bring it around. Make sure they move freely as well. Before we're actually going to install our connecting rods on our pistons and start putting it in our actual bore, there's a little bit of math involved here, and I'm going to let Eric explain what's going on, because what Yamaha has is a series of different bearings based on journal sizes for the crankshaft or the connecting rod. You have to know which one you want when you're ordering it. Is it going to be a green one, a blue one, a brown one? And those are very important to have the right oil clearance on this. And there's a little bit of math involved, and Eric really has been doing a lot of the behind the scenes stuff for me, writing things down and getting all of this together. He's going to have a little bit of a better way to explain what we're doing next to find the right bearing for our connecting rod, because we want to do it now while we have everything on a bench before we start putting it in an engine and maybe having to take everything back apart. So Eric, kind of walk us through what's going on and how we're going to be able to determine the bearing size.
Sure, Joe. Yeah, so as Joe said, at this step we want to determine which bearings we need specifically for not only our rod journals but the main crank journals as well. And this is where it's very helpful to have the proper service information and pay very close attention to it to make sure that you get the correct bearing. Now there's 3 sets of numbers that are important here. There's a set of numbers here we'll start with. This is the crankshaft web. There are some numbers marked on the crank web, and there's also a set of numbers that are going to be on this counterweight of the crankshaft here, and there are numbers on each connecting rod. So it's very helpful in this case, if you have a pad and paper, to kind of use this as a cheat sheet to do your calculations. The service manual will walk you through step by step exactly how you determine which bearing goes in which position. Luckily, the math is only simple subtraction, or else I'd be in trouble. But they consider this journal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the main journals, and these connecting rod journals, they refer to them as pins. They call them 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you want to make sure you keep that in mind as well. So what we've done is we've done our calculations. We've taken into account the numbers in all 3 positions and noted down exactly which bearing goes in exactly which spot, and we've laid them out here so we know exactly exactly which one to use. However, what we have run across, this is one of the original connecting rods right here, and it has the numbers stamped on it. And what we've run across is on the new connecting rods, there are not numbers stamped on here. So we're going to have to decide a starting point for our calculations, and we're going to install the connecting rods, and we're going to use plastic gauge to measure the oil clearance. That's a step that as Joe mentioned earlier, I believe that you do all the time regardless, to make sure that your clearance is correct. And in this situation, it's even more critical. So we're gonna start there, and we'll start with our connecting rods, and we'll see what we have.
And if you are experiencing any challenges with this kind of build, don't hesitate to reach out to SPT directly at their tech support number. I called them. I talked to Sean over there, and he's gave us, he said, look, we know where ours aren't stamped. He said, so for you, in your case, what you want to do is use the plastic gauge method. And then of course he said, after you've got your clearances checked, if you have any other questions or need more guidance, he said, call us back. So they were right there, right on the phone for us to kind of help us out understand that since we didn't have a stamping on this one, what our next step was. And especially for you at home, if you're doing this at home and you don't understand it, you can either call them, they're right on the phone, they were no wait at all, and then they'll help walk you through this process so you're not kind of lost. You know, again, and if you got a service manual, which has helped, you might have seen Eric in the background just writing notes and trying to sift through all the bearings that we have, which saves us a lot of time. But we still have to check those clearances no matter what. So we're going to start with doing that right now with the connecting rods right here while we have everything out. We're going to go through the torquing process that's laid out in the service manual and try to determine which color bearing we need for our connecting rods and our crankshaft. So we are starting with one bearing here, and in the first step and part of the service manual is going to tell you to put your bearing in both your cap and the actual rod itself, and then you're going to torque it down and essentially seat that bearing before we put it on our actual journal on our crankshaft and start checking our clearances. So that's what Eric's doing right now. He's installing the bearings, and we did choose a brown one to start based on our numbering system. That's where we're going to start right now. That may change. We don't know until we actually crank this down, but first step is actually don't even install that on the crankshaft. It's torque it to 22 foot-pounds here, seat the bearing, take it off, and then put it on. So that's what we're doing now.
As is typical with all engine bearings, they install with the tang of the bearing in the groove on the cap or the rod. So we've got the bearings installed,
Great point.
tang to tang, and then the bolts, they do specify to lubricate the bolts before torquing them into that 22 foot-pounds. So we're going to put a little bit of lubrication on the end of each bolt. Doesn't take much, just a little bit.
Another thing to keep in mind is these rods and the cap do not, make sure you pay attention. You do not want to install it the wrong way, because those are a cracked style cap, which means they only fit on one way. You could get it the other way, but just make sure you pay attention on how you take it apart when you put it back together. We've got the bearings seated in the connecting rod. They told us to install the bearings, and we kind of went with the original formula, went with the bearings we think they are. We're going to verify that now using some plastic gauge. Plastic gauge is a device that's going to actually squeeze between our journal and our bearing. And there is a gauge on the plastic gauge that you buy that you'll measure that distance to verify and check your clearance. And we're getting ready to do that now. We're cutting off small strips of the plastic gauge. That's what Eric's getting ready to do now. And then actually the plastic gauge is inside the package, and it's very small. It's like a little piece of noodle, but it's thinner than that. It's also not harmful to the bearing surface or the rod surface or the crank journal or anything like that. It'll be able to be just washed away and it won't harm any damage. But what we're going to do now is install these one at a time and check the clearance and see if we've got to change a bearing or if we're within specifications. And there's the plastic gauge. You can see how it's very thin, so don't drop it, you'll lose it. But we're gonna put that right on our actual journal surface right now, and then we're gonna install the cap and our connecting rod, torque it down to specifications, and then we'll use the gauge that came on the side of the packaging to determine our clearance, and we'll compare that to specifications to verify that our clearance is okay, or do we need to make a bearing change?
Two things we want to make sure of when we're installing these connecting rods to check the oil clearance. One is that you install the rod, make sure the marking on the rod faces the front of the crankshaft, which is this end right here. And the other thing that's very important with the plastic gauge, you'll see we've supported this crankshaft upwards a little bit so we can move the plastic gauge to the top of the journal. When you install the cap, you need to make sure that it goes straight down on top of the plastic gauge. You don't want that plastic gauge to roll at all because it's going to, in effect, flatten it out and change what the reading is.
Another thing to keep in mind is when you have this all together like this, we're just going to clamp this down. We're just torquing it. We're just getting our clearance. Don't take the connecting rod and start moving it up and down, and you have no oil on these bearings. You have no anything to protect that bearing surface or the actual journal surface. We're only doing this to check our clearance. So don't take the connecting rod and see how it feels on the crankshaft and start playing around with it. That's not for what we want to do right now.
And also, is another reason it helps to have somebody else here when you do this, is if you don't keep this crankshaft and these connecting rods perfectly stationary, it's also going to roll the plastic gauge and ruin your reading. So we need to keep everything in the same exact spot.
So the specification here in the service manual says we're going to go to 37 foot-pounds on these and then an additional 90 degrees after that. So we're going to torque these down to the specified reading that they're supposed to be, then we're going to check our clearance. Okay. So now if you guys can get a close-up of this, you'll be able to see that we squished that plastic gauge down. And what we're going to do now is our gauge over there that came on our packaging and see what that specification and how much clearance there actually is for oil now, to see if we're within specifications or if we need to change to a different bearing.
So we're going to hold this gauge right up to the plastic gauge, and we're going to see exactly which portion lines up. It looks like we have just about 1/1000th.
Yeah, it's just about there. So based on what we just did and checking all of this, we had originally selected a brown bearing here based on, again, that crankshaft numbering system that was on here versus the web. So we actually just went with, let's just see and give ourselves a starting point. So we went with a brown one here, then we went green, green, green based on that numbering system. So this one was different than this one, but doing what we just did proves that both of them are within manufacturer specifications. We have chosen the right bearing size, so we can go ahead and install the other ones. Anytime you're doing this stuff, you have a doubt and you want to just put it in and check it and compare it, you can. That's what you do with using plastic gauge. So we just did it here. You would repeat it for the other two as well to verify that you're within specs. But right now we definitely have these ones are good to go. So.
And something else that you can look for that's a very nice representation is when you look at the footprint left from the plastic gauge, you also want to make sure that it's a uniform thickness across the surface of the journal. That indicates that there's no problem with taper or out of round or anything.
Great point, yeah. You don't want to see it kind of going.
You don't want to see it like a triangle or anything like that.
Exactly, that's a great point to bring up. That's another indication of not just checking the clearance, but like you said, being able to give yourself another little bit of a check on that crank and everything else. So, sounds good.
All right, let's get into the other two. We are going to clean off the plastic gauge here. It's just it's nice to get it all cleaned off and have a nice clean surface before our final assembly. But plastic gauge is oil soluble, so if in the event there's just a little trace of it left, that's not going to be a problem.
I'm just removing the old sealing RTV that they use to seal the webbing here, or our girdle, second part of the block, the lower part of the block. They use a sealant here. And what we're getting ready to do is put the crank in here with our bearings based on the numbering system that Eric had found. And I just want to make sure I have no evidence of the old sealant here. That'll affect the torque on this, and we don't want to have anything that's going to cause any discrepancies to verify our oil clearance. So I'm just making sure this is all clean. Now, of course, when we're all done, we will use some new sealant to seal this back here. But right now, we're just wanting to make sure that it's all uniform and clean. I just don't want any discrepancies on my readings for my bearings. What we're doing now is we're installing the new bearings in the lower half and the upper half or lower half, whatever you want to call this part of this block, how it's kind of a split block like this where our crankshaft is. We're installing the bearings based on the numbering system that we had on the webbing and the new crankshaft. Right now, what we want to do again is, just like we did with connecting rods, is we want to verify that those clearances are correct. So we're going to install the bearings, we're going to install the crank, we're going to torque it down to specifications, and then check the clearances. So right now you don't want to add any assembly lube or anything like that. Once you have the plastic gauge in place and start torquing it down, we don't want to spin the crank. We will add assembly lube after we verified our clearances are correct, once we've verified that. Got it?
Yep. So
right.
we'll set the crankshaft in place.
You'll see he's going to take his time, he's going to go slow. We don't want to gouge any surfaces of that crankshaft. Everything is brand new and very pretty. It's got a mirror-like finish on it, and we don't want to nick it and cause any damages.
Now, we'll put our plastic gauge on at this point, and you do want to be careful that you do not run a plastic gauge across any of these oil passageways here.
Great point.
First time, guys. Plastic gauge is in place.
Great.
Bearings are in place. So.
Front, yep.
Yep.
There we go.
All right.
While Eric's going ahead and looking up the torque spec for our main journals, one other thing to keep in mind is we don't want to reuse the bolts that came out of here. They are a stretch bolt. So what does that mean? You might hear stretch bolt, you could hear torque to yield. They're essentially a one-time use bolt, meaning you do not want to reuse them. And that also goes for the head or the cylinder head as well. SBT has provided me brand new bolts to use for this. It is a one-time use. We're going to be okay to crank it down and then just go ahead and remove them, and it's not going to destroy the bolt when we do that. But again, you do want to replace these bolts when you're servicing your engine. Do not reuse them, because a torque to yield or a stretch bolt is designed to basically change the integrity of the bolt as it's torqued down, which means it's not going to have the same shape it did when it went in. So we don't want to reuse that, because you're not going to be able to get the same torque out of that bolt ever again, and it's not going to have the same clamping force that it did before. So while Eric's looking that up, just keep that in mind, something to kind of, when you're doing a rebuild, get the bolts too. You may have noticed I just reused the old bolts. That's because Yamaha told us to. So these are the old bolts right now. It's okay to check in for the clearances right now. And then once we get our clearances, I'm going to take these bolts out and I'm going to throw them in the trash and we'll use new ones. The other ones that are in the outside corners around here are not torque to yield bolts, and those do not need replaced. It's just the ones that are the larger ones that I'm using right now. You'll notice there's a sequence of tightening these bolts, so don't just randomly tighten them up to 22. Follow the sequence that's provided to you in the service manual so you do it correctly. So the initial reading is 22 foot-pounds. Once you have that all done, then we're going to go back in sequence and we're going to go 90 degrees. So I'm going to be creating a 90-degree angle with this, just like that. If you wonder, or if you're not sure of yourself, you could always get an angle meter that will move the degrees as you tighten. Well, yeah, it should. Now, time to loosen them all back up. All that work. Now you gotta loosen it all back up. All right.
All right, this had dowel. Let's see if we can try to get it straight up off here. It had dowel pins, didn't it?
Beautiful.
Straight up. All right, I got it.
You got it?
Okay. Well, it looks pretty consistent all the way across the board.
Does it look good?
Well, so far, but let's see what...
That is very consistent.
Yeah, it's very nice.
So the specifications in the manual say we can go all the way up to 39, which we want to be a little bit lower than that. I'd prefer it. And right now we're right in the middle of that. And that looks really great.
Yeah, these are all very consistent.
Yeah, they are.
From a standpoint of
they
paper
look
or anything
exactly
like
the
that.
same,
They're
which is
perfect,
really
yeah.
what you want, you know. So
yes, looks great.
we can clean that little plastic gauge off and continue reassembly. The bearings that we've selected work well with this based on the numbering system, based on what we found on the webbing. So Eric did a great job. Couldn't have done it without him. So you'll see we have everything nicely laid out. We're getting ready to reinstall our connecting rods onto our pistons, and then we're going to put the pistons into the block and start buttoning up this lower assembly. You'll see Eric has everything really nicely laid out. When it comes to engine work, I can't stress it enough, organization, cleanliness, and keeping everything in order is imperative to have a good build on your engine. It doesn't matter if it's this Yamaha engine or a V8 350 engine that you're working on. It is imperative to have everything in order of the way you want to do it. So we're going to be installing the pistons onto the connecting rods and then starting to move that. One thing you'll keep in mind, always pay attention to your lubrication points. We're going to use some lubrication inside here in the actual spot where the wrist pin goes as well. We're going to lube all these up as well. And then we'll show you installing the clips that retain this, and then one of the precautions that we had that you'll see as well. So we've got it all laid out. So what we're going to do is start reassembling all this and kind of getting ready to drop that in. You'll notice that the maintenance manual actually calls for engine oil. We're using a little bit of an assembly lube. Instead of engine oil, this engine's going to be sitting and getting some other work done for a little while. So I'd like to have a little bit of a thicker film on there. So we're using assembly lube, which is absolutely fine to do as well. And honestly, I prefer, and Eric does as well, we both prefer assembly lube when installing these pistons and components back together. The worst part about any engine and where most of your wear occurs is on startup. And all these components have not had any oil on them, so it's important to keep something on there and put something on there, especially for that first initial startup after you get everything all done. Now remember, there is a correct way and an incorrect way to install the connecting rod onto the piston. Your piston is locating which way it should face the front of the engine towards the timing chain, so that's got to go that way. And the marking on this connecting rod also needs to be on the same side. This side doesn't have any markings. This side does. This is the correct way. So you can actually install these backwards, so pay attention when you're doing that the mark here and that this is all lined up so it's going to face the right direction in the engine. You'll also notice we use these clips, me and Eric are installing these right now, into the actual, where the wrist pin goes. So these are what's going to retain keep the piston ring inside over here, inside our piston. And you'll notice also on here there's a slot here. You won't want to put the clip in so that the end of that's kind of lining up with that. You want to really just offset the piston ring pin, the clip over here, so it's more like that. More over here, so I don't have the end of it in the area where you would remove it. So make sure you kind of offset that a little bit.
Something else that's important to point out, as is true with anything that you get into when you're reassembling an engine, clearances are very, very tight. But you want to make sure that everything slides together very easily. And as you can see, this wrist pin just slides in real easily, and that the connecting rod moves easily, that the piston moves easily on the wrist pin. It is possible, although it's uncommon, it's certainly possible you could have a burr somewhere, something that could cause the wrist pin to hang up. So you just want to make sure that everything is basically smooth as silk as you're putting it together and once it's fully assembled.
That's a great point.
These clips are a little tricky, as you can see. We're kind of struggling a little bit, but your always better off just doing this by hand as opposed to trying to use a small screwdriver or pick, because there's too many opportunities to slip or perhaps scratch something, the piston skirt, or make a piston ring or something like that. So best off just using your hands and fighting through it.
So our pistons are completely assembled now with our connecting rod, new wrist pins, new rings, new bearings. Our clearances have already been checked. What we're going to do now is we're going to actually take the crankshaft back out of here, set it off to the side so we can actually install these next. Because of that webbing area that's on the bottom half of this block, you can't get to the connecting rod bolts. So you kind of got to do this one, and we were thinking it was a little bit of an odd way where we're going to install the pistons. The piston rings themselves will keep it in the bore when we put the block kind of back upside down, and then we're going to work together to lower the crank back on there. And then actually we're starting with the connecting rods before we start with the actual main bearing torquing process. So
yeah, completely unusual.
Yeah, it is a little bit, which makes it another challenge, but nothing unusual at this point with anything being challenging on this motor. So we're going to take that crank off, and then we're also going to put some oil inside the cylinder, on the cylinder walls, and we're going to show you how to use a ring compressor next to get these in here. The pistons in there, so you don't have to try and try and use screwdrivers or anything like that. So we'll use a piston ring compressor on that. So now we've got everything assembled. We're going to start assembling and installing our pistons into the actual bore themselves. I already went ahead and cleaned that out again. Now, Eric, talk to everybody a little bit about what we're going to be doing and the tool that we're using a little bit here, and how we're doing this.
What we're going to do is we're going to use a piston ring compressor to compress these rings down so that they'll slide into the bore easily. And what's really important is that you don't want the rings to hang up on the deck of the block at all, because you can potentially crack or damage a ring. So that's the most important part about the ring compressor, and it allows them to slide in easily. We're also going to be dipping the pistons into motor oil before we slide them in, and you can see we've made kind of a special container to put our motor oil in, so we can dip the piston down, just let it soak there for just a couple seconds so the oil really gets throughout all of the rings and everywhere, so we have good lubrication that'll be on the cylinder walls before we slide them down in.
And another thing to keep in mind too, if you have a piston that has a little bit of the wear at the top, it could make it even more of a challenge. So it was important for us to hone that out and remove that area where the piston doesn't quite go all the way up, where you could have a little bit of carbon buildup here on the top. You want to make sure that that's gone as well, so you don't have anything that could cause it to really make it more of a challenge to get those pistons in and the rings in. So make sure everything is good before you do that.
And the final step is that, again, before we slide it down in, we're just going to make sure that the marking on the connecting rod, we're going to double check this marking with the marking on our pistons, even though we've just put them together. It's a final check, make sure, okay, yes, we did it correctly. And this is the timing chain side of the engine. We know that these face the front of the engine. And I always like to take one more look just at the clips, the wrist pins, make sure everything's smooth, and one final look also at the orientation of the piston rings.
Yeah.
Let's just, we'll take a look and you can see where the gaps are, because we know that the gaps have specific locations primarily so they don't line up and allow any compression, bypass. And the top ring and second ring should be 180 degrees apart. So once you've confirmed all that, you're ready to go with your installation. Yeah,
those are great things to remember too. After handling these pistons a while, the rings can move a little bit, so you always want to double check that before you're finally doing all that. And another thing when you're using and doing actually installing these is we're going to use a plastic hammer or wood. You do not really want to use anything that you're going to be driving the piston down and hitting the top of it. You want to use something where it's plastic, softer than the material that you're using, but it's going to give you a little bit of oomph to put it in there. This is more of a feel thing than I think of anything else. I think the first time you do it, it can be a little odd. Yeah. But once you do one and you kind of feel how it goes, you really can gain the momentum and understanding on how these work.
Absolutely.
You notice I'm getting a little bit of this oil on the skirt too. I like to make sure everything's nice and coated real well. And I'm using a quality product from AMSOIL. AMSOIL's provided us the engine oil for this. So nothing but the best is going in this motor. I don't know how you want to.
Well, we'll just yeah, what's on top there? Yeah, we'll kind of figure it out. All right.
So now what that ring compressor did is putting all the rings all the way into their lands, so that when we drive it down, they'll pop out a little bit, which is normal. But to get them in, we've got to be able to compress those rings all the way inside the piston ring area itself before we do it. And this is what this ring compressor did. It just compressed everything down, and now we have a straight shot to go down in there. Are we ready?
We're ready.
There she goes.
There we go. Okay.
Beautiful.
This process can be a little tricky, you know, as Joe mentioned. So you want to make sure that you get the piston ring compressor square on the piston, and as you get it square on there, and get it really compressed down pretty tight. And when you're sliding this down, just go nice and slow so you don't bang the rod against the sides of the cylinder bore. And when you get to the piston skirts, just go real gentle, just to get them lined up nice. And then, I like to tap down on the top of the piston compressor just to make sure that it is seated against the deck of the block. If not, a ring can pop out, and it certainly may happen. So as Joe mentioned, it's kind of a feel. You need to make sure you don't go too hard and too fast. If something pops out, you don't want to just drive it home and break the ring.
Exactly.
Perfect.
Got it. Beautiful.
Now that we have the crank in, as you go to put each rod cap on, just make sure you double check that you're getting the cap in the correct position. Does the bearing tangs always line up? That's kind of a standard rule. So just take one last look, make sure you get them on the right way.
Each connecting rod and each cap on these are unique to each other. You cannot mix them up. You could, but the problem is you're going to cause some serious engine damage if you do that. So make sure you keep the cap with the correct connecting rod and installed on the correct position as to not damage anything. You'll also notice we do have a little bit of lube on our threads of our connecting rod bolts. As specified by the service manual, always replace the connecting rod bolts with new ones. If you were going to just reuse your connecting rods, make sure you get new bolts as well, just like we have talked in the past. These are torque to yield, one-time use only. Do not reuse them. So you'll notice this is a two-step process when you're tightening things up. It calls for 37 foot-pounds initially, and then you're going to go the 90-degree sweep again once you do that. So I'm going to kind of get myself straightened out so I see what's... And then we're going to go 90 degrees. There we go. There we go. All right. When we're ready to install our second part of where our main caps live, you've got to use a sealant in here. There is no gasket. They use an RTV. We have a gray, ultra gray, high torque, and it's basically an RTV that we're going to use to seal these. And we're just going to run a bead on both sides of this block.
Well, you don't need to use too much of this at all because you know, these mating surfaces basically come directly together, so it's going to squirt out when you get to, so you just want a really thin bead. You know, we're just making sure we don't miss any little spots, but you don't want to get too much because it would squirt out everywhere and affect the oil flow back, you know, down as it travels through the engine down into the oil pan. So just use a sparing amount. And you also have, you know, there is a working time with this type of sealant. So, you know, when you apply it,
yes.
make sure you're ready to to assemble everything right away and get everything torqued. And the service manual is nice for this. It gives you a little path if you have any question about exactly where to apply the sealant. The service manual tells you exactly where to put it. There's also a rubber O-ring that we have installed a new one, and the service manual calls for marine grease to be applied around that O-ring.
Right now we've got it all bolted together. Everything's torqued down with our new crankshaft bearings. We've got new pistons, new piston rings, connecting rods. Everything and all the internals on the rotating assembly have been replaced. Right now we're just making sure that everything is free after we've torqued everything down to make sure that it spins as it should. And right now everything is rotating as it should. At this point we have finished completely reassembling the entire rotating assembly of the lower half of this unit right now. At this point, the only thing left for us to do is start putting the parts back on that we took off in, I believe, episode 2 when you saw us disassemble it. So really there's no reason to show that again because we're just going to start reinstalling the things that we've already taken off in a previous episode. And that's just going to be our oil pan and some of our back components and oil pump like that. And start then focusing our attention to the cylinder head. So for right now, with the help of Eric, we really got this tightened up today with all the new bearings. Again, great help from SBT when I needed some help calling for tech support. And everything seems to be, it feels great.
Yeah,
so
it feels great.
Can't thank Eric enough for helping us out today with this whole build on the lower end. If you're watching this video, you could really see how well and how great it is to have a second person helping you out, especially trying to decipher some of those numbers, helping keeping organized, you know, really getting those pistons in. So it's great to have a second person if you can get one to help you out with a lot of this stuff. Again, thanks to SBT for the components that we installed in this engine. We're going to be moving on to the cylinder head, so stay tuned. Thanks again for watching.